Hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion of Chapter 13 in our textbook. We are going to be looking at practical contracts tonight. We're going to take a look at some of the parts of a contract. We're going to take a look at some of a little bit of the theory of contract law again, adding to the discussion that we've had in the past 2 weeks. But primarily, we're going to be focusing on the contract itself, the form of the contract, the parts of the contract, what goes into a contract. We also are going to start our discussion with talking about why do we even want to have a contract. There's a big difference sometimes between the way that business people look at lawyers and the way lawyers look at lawyers. Business people sometimes think of lawyers as gumming up the deal, stopping the deal, preventing the deal from happening. And that's not what most lawyers want to do. It's certainly not what I want to do as a transactional lawyer. I've prided myself on most of my career as being a very commercially oriented lawyer. But my role as a lawyer is to help guide my client, understand what the risks are, the legal risks are, and where possible, take those risks and try to avoid those risks by drafting contracts that address the issues that might come back to be problems later on. Lawyers are not as lawyers are more risk averse than business people are. In general, lawyers tend to focus on what could go wrong. And sometimes business people don't understand that. And sometimes lawyers don't understand that comes a point in time where they need to let go too. And they need to let deals happen. I remember as a young associate, there were some partners in my firm, especially in the real estate department where I worked, who were so cautious, who were so careful. We often wondered how they closed any transaction because they were always finding problems and always trying to. It seemed like they were trying to find ways around doing the deal. Maybe they were just being careful and they were just trying to make sure that the client didn't make any inadvertent mistakes. And now, 30 years later, I'm the partner, and maybe I'm the one that people are saying, oh my God, he's trying to slow the deal down. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to help my client understand what the risks are, where those risks might be, what steps we might be able to take to alleviate those risks. Ultimately, it's the client's decision as to what course of action to take. And that's what lawyers have to understand. And that's when there's a good tension between the lawyer and the lawyer wanting to be a little bit more cautious, the client looking for the ability to do something, wanting to do something, and you have to find the right balance. Now, when parties come together and they want to do a transaction, they sometimes wonder, do we need a contract? Do we need a written contract? We agree, we know what we want, here's what we want to do, we both understand that. Well, there are certain circumstances where it really does matter if you have a written contract. First off, you need a written contract to even have a contract if your transaction falls under the statute of frauds and it requires a written contract. If the deal is really crucial to your life or to your business, you are putting your entire business, your entire livelihood at risk if you don't put your agreement into writing. And I don't mean to sound dramatic, but in an oral contract, it's your word against the counterparty's word. Where you have a written contract, you have written evidence as to what your intentions were. And sometimes in the course of a business, there is a falling out between parties that were friends, that were partners, and they need that agreement to help them sort out their affairs and determine who has what rights and who has what responsibilities. with respect to their business. You especially need a writing if the terms of your agreement are complex. Now, most of the contracts with which I deal in my practice, the terms of the contracts are exceedingly complex, sometimes mind-bogglingly complex. I just negotiated a private equity transaction, and the transaction documentation is so complex. Even I don't fully understand it. Now, I didn't draft most of it. Most of it was drafted by the lawyers for the other side in the transaction. And my job was to help my client read it and understand it and explain it. But there is no way that that type of transaction could be done with an oral contract. There were just too many twists and turns and permutations, and there was a lot of money involved. So it was absolutely critical that that agreement be in writing. So now we have 4 reasons why the agreement needs to be in writing. We've covered the first 3. The statute of frauds requires it. If your life or your business depend on it, if it's a really critical contract, if the terms of your agreement are complex and ones that are not going to be easily remembered if you leave the contract in an oral form. And the 4th is where you don't have an ongoing relationship of trust with the other party. You might be able to do a relatively simple, straightforward contract agreement with someone you know and trust and deal with on a regular basis on the basis of an oral transaction. But if you don't have that long-standing relationship of trust with your counterparty, you're taking a tremendous amount of risk by not putting your contract into writing, because you don't know how this person is going to react. You don't know how this person is going to be to work with when you get into your arrangement. You're 1, 2, 3 years down the road. You've committed a substantial amount of money to this project. So if you don't have a long-standing relationship of trust with the counterparty, you are definitely better off getting your agreement into writing. So that's why you want to put your agreement into writing. And you want to put your agreement into writing because you want to be able to have confidence in that each party understands their rights and their responsibilities. And when it comes to putting together that contract, this is when the business person and the lawyer sort of have to team together, have to work together. You know, some business people call lawyers the business prevention department, as I mentioned, because they think that lawyers are trying to mess up their deals. Business people tend to be optimists. If they weren't optimistic, if they didn't believe in their product or in their service or in their agreement, they wouldn't be doing this. They believe that they've negotiated, when they come to their lawyer with a transaction that they're about to enter into, they think they've negotiated all of the points, all of the fine points with their counterparty. And lawyers are risk averse, as I said. Lawyers, their responsibility is to always think about what might go wrong and how might we prevent that. We have to prevent and take action to avoid something going wrong. Lawyers like to get all of the touchy subjects negotiated up front. That's the way that I like to work as a lawyer. I like to make sure that anything that could be a problem is dealt with. We want to make sure that the parties understand all aspects of their transactions before they enter into them. Now, one thing that lawyers and business people can do is they can play good cop, bad cop. They can take situations where the lawyer tries to be very firm on an issue, and the business person can be a little bit more flexible, and they can sometimes get to compromise with the other side because the lawyers are sort of staking out positions that are sort of on the extreme edge, and the business people are trying to move the parties together. I remember once I was negotiating a lease with a client. My client was the landlord. We were trying to lease a fairly large piece of space to a tenant for 10 years at a time when real estate conditions were not particularly good. So this was a really important transaction. And my client and I talked in advance, and we determined that the best way to work was for us to do this good cop, bad cop routine. And he was the amenable one. He was the one who always seemed like the voice of reason. And when I came in, I was the hammer. I was like, no, that the law doesn't allow that. We can't do that. And done sparingly, it worked, and it was a really good negotiation. We ended the transit. We got the transaction. We got the transaction on terms that my client really liked, and using his business sense and my legal sense, we were able to combine and get a really good transaction result. Lawyers, business people can use their lawyers and blame their lawyers sometimes, and somehow build a little bit of goodwill with the other side by saying, oh, my lawyer, he's so difficult, he's always raising all these hard issues, and that can sometimes bridge the gap and get compromise and get the deal transacted. So we have to be careful when we're talking about contracts and the negotiation of contracts, because we always want to make sure that number one, that we get the deal done if the deal should be done, and number two, my job as a lawyer, and maybe your job as business people later on, or maybe your job as lawyers later on, will be to make sure that we avoid any unnecessary risks. A client has to be very careful when the client is hiring a lawyer. Look, the client has to hire a lawyer with whom the client is going to feel comfortable. The client has to be able to appreciate what the lawyer is doing, and the lawyer has to remember that the lawyer's job is ultimately to make a deal if there's a deal to be made. The lawyer has to be the deal maker, not the deal breaker. The lawyer the business person always has to make sure that the lawyer understands the lawyer's proper function in negotiating a contract. And the lawyer's job is almost never to tell the client that they can't do something. But instead of telling the client that they can't do something, the lawyer is supposed to help the client find a way to do it. In my industry right now, I work with a lot of traders on trading desks for hedge funds and investment banks, and the one word that they never want to hear is no. They want to do something, you really can't tell them no, that they can't do it. What you can tell them is, it won't work that way, but here's the way that it will work. You have to give them an alternative. And that's what the good business lawyer does. So if you're at all interested in becoming a business lawyer, you have to learn how to operate in the commercial context, and you have to learn how to be a deal maker. And that sometimes being a deal maker means you have to give your client alternatives. If they can't do what they want to do in the way that they want to do it, but you have to help them find the way to do it, because if you don't find a way to help them do it, they might just go ahead and do it in the wrong way, and that will create more problems for them later on as they continue on.